wonderful talk tonight. So we planned all of our talks through the year, and next month is going to be the history of motorized emergency vehicles, and that's on June 10th. And if we ever need to cancel a talk, it's either going to be on Facebook, announced on Facebook, or we will email all of our members. So July 10th is our big event for US 12 Cruise. It's going to be Cruise in the Museum. The Dearborn and Old Engine Club is going to be here. We're going to have kids crafts and storytellers. We're going to have an old Huron car that was made here. And also we're going to have a flea market. And we need all of our members to donate their items after their spring cleaning. And that's going to be like a fundraiser for us. So a nice flea market out here. So get cleaning and bring it to the museum Wednesdays and Thursdays for Tyler to go through. And last but not least, and that's it, I'm going to introduce Debra, Reid from the Henry Ford Museum, talking about farms from 1850 to 1910. So take it away.
Thank you so much. This is a real pleasure to be here. I hear it's the first time you've gathered together in this past year. So what an honor to be out here in the open air with you all. I would say that back in the day, in the early 20th century, they used to do this pretty regularly. They'd put up a sheet and they'd have the old moving picture reels, and they would have community movies. So I don't know if any of you ever did that.
Used to be right there in that grass.
Huh. Yeah. So we're right there at the when this ends, we can think we're just carrying on with our outdoor movie. My family was elderly, and they remember doing that. That was way down in southern Illinois, but yeah. So this is nothing new, and I appreciate your fortitude in being here and helping it all happen. So many hands and hard work seems to summarize farm life pretty well, and I'd also like to get a sense of how many of you grew up on farms. So a few, yeah. Was that in this area? Nobody in this area right here, yeah? Did you grow up here in this area? Not you?
Yeah, on Lily Road.
Uh-huh. Well, this is a pretty prime real estate. It may not look that way if you look at that 1818 survey map in there where it says marshy land or swampy land or an elm grove or an oak plain. Obviously, different parts of this township had different values as agricultural land. But it all obviously transformed remarkably in what, less than a century. So I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about the women that were central to that. Often the historical societies feature men because the historical records feature men. And I have tried to tease out some stories of women. And I do have words on the screen and images to show. If you can't see them, which I couldn't if I was sitting where you are, Tyler has this, so, and much of it you might find familiar because your Facebook page has been a resource, as have some other publicly available images. So, but just to get us all on the same page, people debate, is farming a business or a way of life? And I think it's obvious that it's both. People built their identity around whether or not they farm, and that's true of the whole family. But it also was a business. It was the way that you produced, processed, and consumed all of the food. So it was really, your survival depended on it, but there was a need for cash, or at least something produced of value. So from the very beginning, farming was a business and a way of life. Women on the farms were central to that. And it is true that there were different jobs that men and women performed on the farms, because trying to grow, process, and preserve all the food that a family needed consumed most hours of the day. But there was also demanding work that women performed right there alongside the men. That was essential for market production. One of the other points up here that you can't really see is about legal authority. I don't know if you can hear me over the train, but I'll go until you tell me to stop. How's that? Okay. Women legally had no authority over their farms. Now let me put that into bigger context. The law in the United States descends from English common law. And this notion that men, when they marry, have ultimate authority over all decisions, and women, when they marry, lose authority. Now, as early as 1844, as this place is being formed, the state of Michigan passed what they call a Married Woman's Property Act, and it gave married women authority over the property that they had before they came into a marriage. So if you're a daughter of a farmer and that farmer dies tragically, back before 1844, they might appoint a guardian, and that guardian would be responsible for making decisions about your property until you married, at which point your husband would then be responsible for that. But after 1844 and the changing laws in Michigan, that woman might still need a guardian, but she had legal responsibility, authority over that property. And that really changed the ways that that married women especially, functioned within the law. It has effect legally. I'm not sure to what degree it affected how farms function. Because as you know, on a farm, there are things you have to do every single day. There are things you do based on seasonal change, and there's an annual rhythm to this. But 1844 is a pivotal time in terms of property. Now the other thing that I wanted to mention, and here we go with your inability to see, maps. So if you could, that's a map of Wayne County in 1860. And I just want to emphasize that part of the reason, oops, it would help if I, that map of 1860 Wayne County included this table, and the table shows the towns in the county and its proximity to Detroit and other big towns in the county. And you're 18 miles from Detroit. That proximity to that growing city affected this community and the agriculture in this community in many ways. And especially the fact that you're sitting right here on this railroad track, which is essential to that business of agriculture. So, whoops, now I'm going backwards. That's interesting. Maybe I'll go this way for now. I'm not used to doing this. This is something else that you really won't be able to see, but I think it's working okay. There's the map from 1860, and I was going to do was talk about a few of the women that I found that were property owners of farms in the county. And the little sheep, or the little farmer, or the cow, or the pig relates to the family. So there's the L.A. Hicks family, which the Hickses there were many of them, and they had quite a lot of property. And I'm not going to go into details about them, but we'll see a photo very soon that shows them. Because there were several brothers, and they're married to interrelated wives, there's a mutual dependency or a kinship that helps support this family. And over in this area is where they're located. There's also the Mary Ann Frank, and I don't know if that's a name that you've ever heard of, but she was from Baden, Germany. Her husband was Michael Frank, and we'll learn a little bit more about her. She dies in her 50s, leaving several children, and including farm property. There's Mrs. Clark Spear. There's Maria Sears. And there's a P. Merriman. And I'm just going to go click. You can find all these names on that 1860 map. Now, the other thing that's important about this, these aren't just people who their names are on a map. That 1860 map of Wayne County includes a business directory, and it has the list of names. It has the L.A. Hicks family, and it has Ann M. Frank, who is a Frank, related to the Mary Ann Frank in ways I have yet to totally figure out. But other immigrants from Baden, Germany. And those folks took it upon themselves to advertise their farm business on that map of Wayne County, which was especially Detroit, and the business relationships, the visibility of prosperity in the relationship to a growing city. The agricultural census and the U.S. Census provides a lot of details about these folks. This is the Amos Hicks family and the Lennox Hicks family. They're at the top of this page, and their several children, and the value of their farm property. So the two farms together were worth almost $11,000, and this is in 1870. They were immigrants from New York, which was quite common, meaning that migration pattern across the northern U.S. into the Midwest. And you can tell by the births of the children where the family was at any given point. So for 15 years, by 1870, this family had been there. And you all have, hello, the wonderful photograph of the Hicks children. 6 of them, 9 of them, I can't remember. But they're photographed, all of them there. Now, this is, the next part of this is what I find most interesting, but it's going to be also difficult to see. Mary Ann Frank. We know, through a will. And the will is 1870. She died in June of that year. She was 53, and she died of heart disease. And I'm going to try to read this so that I don't, well, I'm going to turn my back to you, but I hope you can still hear me. This is the last will and testament of Mary Ann Frank from the town of Nankin, Wayne County, in the state of Michigan. She's of sound mind and body, and memory, and considering the uncertainty of this frail and mortal life, blessed be Almighty God for the same, I do make, publish, ordain, and declare this my last will and testament. And she is now bequeathing her estate of Mr. Frank, deceased, which was left to me, dower, be equally divided among my children, basically. Dower. So a dower is the provision that a husband would leave his wife. Usually it's a third of an estate for her use until she dies. And then it must be distributed in a way, and she's taking responsibility for that. Sometimes it was simply a room in a house that a husband, even on a farm, might give to his wife, and she would live with children until her death. So, can't see it there, but the next page, I give and bequeath to my heirs. This is Caroline Frank, Charles Frank, Mary Frank, Edward Frank, who have lived with me since the death of my husband, 4 acres. And then she goes on that she's going to give each of those named folks a cow apiece, and a bed and bedding apiece, and then to Charles Frank a horse to call his, and to Edward Frank a horse of equal worth, and to Charles Frank the light buggy called his. Now there's a person she's left out of that, and that's Caroline, or Anne. And so here's the name, here's Mrs. Frank before she dies, early in June. Caroline is 21 years old. Charles is a farm laborer. Mary, another sister. Edward, they're all listed right there, all in the family, and they each have $900 in real estate. They probably inherited that from their father, so that's theirs, not hers already. And at the very top is Mary Ann Frank, who has $3,000 in real estate, $1,200 in personal property, and yet she's listed as keeping house. But we know that that's a farm. What's the point of all of this? It's the precarious nature that a farm family finds themselves in when the husband, who is the farmer, the person that's most legally responsible and has authority for the property, dies. And he was only, well, he would have been in his 60s at the most when he died. He wasn't an elderly person. So he left these children who, you know, by now the eldest is 21, but still the eldest is a female, not the same legal authority. And several sons, none of whom in 1870 are technically 21. 21 then is now was a symbol of authority, or a symbol of adulthood. Sure, you could marry and you could purchase property before you were 18, but still 21 was a legal age. So what do these children do? Especially now that their mother has died. So she appoints an executor who is male, and likely her brother, based on her maiden name and his last name, to be responsible for this family. Even though this family also owns property and that cow and other things that they need to set up housekeeping. Are they going to be farmers on that acreage that they possess? Can they figure out a way to do that? Or will they do what many families in this situation ended up having to do, and that's sell that property if they can't accumulate more to farm? The next few slides are very familiar to you. They're maps, and all they do is point out the proximity between here and Detroit. And obviously it's close. And what I wanted to do was emphasize the ways that the town of Wayne grows up around this agricultural area, with these farm families that consist of the stable ones consist of a male head of household and a farm wife and several children. Many businesses in this town may not look like they're agricultural or related to agriculture in any way, but they are. So that is I can't even read. Oh, sorry. The Tremont House, which was a building right on a corner, but behind it was a stable, and it was a place where not only travelers stabled their horses, but horse-related care would come and go through there. Anytime you see a horse and a stable with a quantity, you have to think of how the people fed those critters. And this is part of that farm economy that occurs, that families all around this place supported. And I will emphasize henceforth, it's families. There's a lucrative market in hay that I think folks don't always think about. And this image of these women that have shinnied up this tree, it's a fantastic image. It's Kate Barney and Daisy Lee in a tree. Behind them, what look like pig pens with a little pig shed, board fence. And I don't know exactly where that was. Their house was near Chase Bank in downtown Wayne. So I mean that would have been, yeah, right here in town. But that was common because people needed to provision themselves even when they lived in town, often with a hog, certainly with a dairy cow. Now, getting a little closer to Detroit, this is Dearborn, because I didn't have photos from here, but one of these is a dry goods store, and dry goods stores are always contracting with folks who are raising perishable fruits and vegetables so that they have those things to sell in local communities if there's not a local market. And then to the right is, you couldn't see this even if you could see the image, but it's hay scales. So these are things flat on the ground, but they are precise, and there's a person appointed in every county to be the superintendent of scales. And that's where folks, farmers from the country would come in, they'd weigh full, and then they'd unload. Probably this way, they would have baled their hay at home in a stationary baler, brought it to town, weighed, gone to the railroad depot and dropped off their bale of hay, and then circled back around to weigh to prove how much they sold. The same setup existed down in Detroit at the hay market. People that were closer, and certainly 18 miles is not far, folks could take loose hay to Detroit too, but otherwise farmers just baled it. And here we are. You can never think that kind of job was just a man's job. It may have been a job that men performed, but there were all these other support systems at work that facilitated that essential business of baling hay, especially for sale. And then, just for emphasis, I didn't have the time to look, but usually the historic records will always identify a significant female farmer. And they do this often indicating that this woman was somehow exceptional. For whatever reason, exceptional. So in Dearborn, it's the daughter of Alfred Woodworth, and her name was Elle, or Eleanor, spelled all kinds of different ways. And they lived right on the corner of Springwells and Greenfield and Dearborn, depending upon what the name of the township was at the time. But she was always pointed out as a farmer, a single woman, had a partner, and farmed. And she farmed perishable vegetables. So she was a small-scale operator. It's hard to find individuals like this, women farmers, in census records, because often, like Mary Frank, they're identified in the census as a housekeeper or keeping house, not necessarily as a farmer. And if they're not identified as a farmer, then there's no agricultural census record taken of that. And it hides them from those major records. You can usually find them among your local history records. So the county courthouse in Wayne County, if you go and start looking through the deed records for this particular township and particular sections of land, or if you have the name of an owner, which is always the easiest way to start, you can dig back and find the women who owned property. The women who owned property, were they called farmers? Not necessarily. Did they operate as decision makers over that property? Maybe, depending upon the interpretation of the law by the men in their lives. So some definitely had a partnership and some did not. And what I wanted to conclude with is the indication that this is ongoing research. It is steady. As people who want to know more about the past try to figure out just how much more complex the past was than either we know or we think. So for us right now at Greenfield Village, we're working on this market building, and it is a reconstruction of Detroit's public market, vegetable market specifically, that operated between 1861 and the early 1890s, just for 30 years, and then it went off for 110 years to Belle Isle. So if any of you were at Belle Isle, you might remember that building as a horse stable or storage building. It's going to help us tell these stories because we've already documented the women who were the members of farm families who brought their poultry or vegetables or fruit or flowers to the market and sold directly to the customers there. We are deep in identifying these individuals, mostly English or Irish women thus far, but there was a large population of German market gardeners and Dutch market gardeners in that area at that time. So it's definitely a work in progress. We also have gotten more names of the farm families that were not coming to the market, but they were growing the goods that these hucksters were selling. And those are your typical, farm families. Head of household, male identified as a farmer, female keeping house, and children, many of whom, if they were males, were listed as farm laborers. Some might be at school. There were some laborers that were also part of the families, including not always all white. There were occasionally black farm laborers too that were hired by these families, must have boarded with them. But I like this picture, and I'll conclude with it. This came off of your Facebook page and is an unidentified woman in a kitchen, likely about 1900. It doesn't say she's on a farm, in a farm kitchen, but this is such a classic photograph of what the daily duties of a woman in a kitchen around 1900 had to do. She's got this big tub with a lid on it. Yes, it could be flat bread, rising, but who knows? It's just constant work, trying to keep folks fed. You can see the kerosene lamps on the shelf. And if you think about that kind of routine, it's easy to understand why certain people on the farms, males, had the duty of being the person in the fields, while the woman on the farm had the duty of being in the kitchen. And then, last but not least, it's 1909, and it's Michigan Avenue right here, or you would be able to tell exactly where it was, right over there. There's an interurban in the middle of the road, and it's an interurban, so not horse-drawn by now, 1908. And there are, though, a horse and buggy on the road, and you can see there's little wooden frames around the tree trunks so that horses aren't going to gnaw them. So it's this time period when, yes, there's an automobile, yes, there's an interurban, but agriculture is still alive and well all around this place, and sustaining this local economy, and it's something that men as well as women do. So that's just it in a nutshell. I would say the really exciting thing is how this relates to some hot topics at the moment, and that is not just trying to, men's and women's history and gender studies and all of that, but it's also the environment, because agriculture is this thing that is working with or against nature, often against it, and food security, and that means how do people keep themselves fed, and both the people on the farm as well as this, totally dependent on the farm, non-farming population that just keeps growing. So I will stop with that, and if anyone has any questions or wants to get up and warm up if you're getting chilly, now's the time. Thank you very much. Yes,
Question.
sir.
So it talked about for the markets, women taking vegetables and animals. So in this time period, did they sell like a lot of like jams and preserves and things like that, or was that mainly just for the household?
The question was about jams and preserves. It's a good question because there's heavily processed foods already. Companies that exist to transform that, and they do it less expensive. But farm families continue to do it too. It's part of that preserve so they can consume later.
Right.
At the market, yes, definitely. People, depending upon the season, were selling jams, jellies, preserves. In fact, they sold all kinds of things that you would think, you'd go today to a seasonal farmer's market and acquire. A lot of the women that were hucksters, they would not necessarily make it themselves, but they would buy it from somebody who had made it, and then they were like middlemen, and they sold it.
Like the extras from the households? So I mean, they collected the extras from different households and then sold it in bulk that way.
Bought it.
Yeah.
Yep, so it would be like a little informal economy. So these women, well, now getting into the weeds a little bit, but this market, the one that's going to be at Greenfield Village, was a public market. So the city of Detroit agreed to build it and to manage it and to charge rent for the stalls. And people did that, and they could then put their address at the city market, stall number 40 in the city directory, for example. But then there were all these people who couldn't afford that or didn't want to have that level of authority over them, and they would put up these pop-up stands outside the market, and they were the ones who were usually going to a family and buying some preserves or buying up flowers or vegetables or fruits. One lady made gingerbread and sold ham hocks, or pig's knuckles, as she called them, and must have been pretty popular. She was featured in the news all the time. She was quite a cause celeb. Her name was Mary Judge. All the trauma that would come of a person that is impoverished and single, or eventually widowed. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know if Henry Ford owned any buildings or property here in Maine?
I could find out because we have the maps of the property that he owned. He had, from what I've heard, about 10,000 acres in Dearborn, but I don't know how many acres he had in this township. But I know because of, I can find out. I've got my card. If you wanted to take it, you could email me. I've been trying to figure out, because there's some Burbanks that lived over way far west in this town, and I've just wondered if he acquired that, because it seems like the Ford Land Company was over there. But him personally, I don't know. Maybe someone else does.
Those maps that you had on there, we have those maps on the wall when you walk in, and I guess you could kind of look to see if there was a Henry Ford. I don't remember seeing a lot of Henry Ford names of Macon Town, unless it was under another name that he acquired land.
He had a mill in Cherry Hill.
Macon Township, where he was
He purchased, so the part that's in the Ford Industries is whether or not it was the Ford Land Company. So that's part of the problem why I can't answer that, because he did himself buy land, but mostly he worked through this land company if it wasn't Ford Motor Company, and I think there's a name for it. It might be Ford Land Company. But we have records for all of that and all the maps. And that's, I think, how it worked with the Ford Industries.
I have a question about the market at Greenfield Village. Are they going to actually open up a market, the farmer's market there during the summer?
Yeah, so what it exactly will entail is what we're working on right now. And we are digging into the historic records to document when strawberries were seasonal in that time period, and when the first asparagus would come in. Did they have just fresh flowers, or seedlings in the spring, or how did it operate? That's what we're working on right now. But yes, Jim Johnson, who directs the village, has this idea that there will be a market when we want to dedicate the building April of 2022, and there'd be an opening market, and then there would be specialty markets, so like a spring flower market, and Saturdays during the summer, Saturday markets. And logistically, we want to do this cooperatively, so we don't want to compete with any of the farm markets that exist. Every one of them is always struggling to keep vendors, and vendors, it's hard work. It still is, and it's very risky. So we're really in the beginning stages of trying to figure this out. But yeah, next year we intend to have more than just the fall market.
Where will the traffic be? Where will the building be in the building?
So it's in this big open area that between Smith's Creek, the silk mill, the generating, Edison Illuminating, and the State Street Market, which is no longer there anymore. Yeah, so that big open area where there used to be Civil War encampments, and this building was as big as a football field, so it's going to be compressed to about a third less. But yeah, it's not quite filling that space, but that's what that space will be. And the bigger picture, we're working on what we call an edible education strategic plan. So that'll be a hub for talking about some of these food stories, local food environments, and what it took to make sure that people were food secure then and now. So it's a pretty ambitious, And I don't know if Alice Waters is this really well-known chef way out in California, but she was one of the people in the States back in '71, so 50 years ago, that really started the slow food movement. And Slow Food USA, I mean, she's credited for spearheading that. So she devised this edible education idea about 25 years ago. And that's what the development folks at the Henry Ford are working towards now. And it's pretty exciting with, things that the Academy will have at their disposal to learn more about food preparation and food science, which can lead them to careers in all manner of things. Not history necessarily, but food history is a really important part of it. Yeah. Thank you so much. These were wonderful questions. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your fortitude.